Hi, I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor from Mode 7. We're the creators of Frozen Synapse, and our most recent game, Frozen Cortex, came out on Steam last week. I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about what it's like to launch a game now, and also give you a sort of general state of the industry, since everyone seems to be doing that these days. So buckle in. Right. Launching a game these days is pretty difficult, as you can imagine. The stat I've been quoting a lot was Dan Grilopoulos' stat, which is that of the 4,200 games on Steam, 2,500 of them were released in the last year. That's ridiculous! That means that this is an incredibly ill-advised thing to be doing, because games aren't an industry anymore, they're more of a medium. It's a genuine way of expressing yourself, which is the modern kind of post-romantic idea of art. And it is kind of massively saturated and difficult. So if you're a developer who is launching a game now, or you're someone who's interested in how games work, what are the key things to do when launching a game on Steam? I think the first foremost thing is that the game has to be amazing, both conceptually and in its execution, and that's pretty difficult. We had a hard time with the Frozen Cortex concept because a lot of confused people thought it was a sports game or an action game, or that it had something to do with American football, or that it had rules that were too complicated for them. I've talked about this elsewhere a lot, so I won't go into that in a huge amount of detail now, but suffice it to say that you can make your life a lot easier with a clear, defined concept that isn't related to things that people think are difficult. People really worry about games being too complicated for them. Conversely, they also worry about games being too simplistic and trivial. So you've got to find a way of pitching your game straight down the middle and trying to get people to understand its mechanics and the nature of it quickly without being intimidated. You have to kind of reassure them and take them in a new direction simultaneously. That's the whole trick. It's very difficult to accomplish, and there's not a lot you can do about it consciously. But the things you can do consciously are remembering to focus on what your game is really about. The trailers that we released that did better were the trailers that had gameplay in them, really gameplay focused, that had a description of what was going on, that tried to get you kind of into the player's mind. If you look at the way YouTubers cover games, like Northern Lion, the way he narrates his gameplay decisions is really cool, and that's what gets people involved. If you ever watch his Binding of Isaac videos, if you're a game developer and you don't watch Northern Lion's Binding of Isaac videos, you are missing the key fundamental way that some people relate to games. I cannot recommend that enough. Just to see someone who is a very committed and high-level player of a game talking through his decisions and making that entertaining for another person really shows you a lot about what people should be getting out of your game design on some level. So a recommendation there. What we're doing when we're trying to make games effectively is trying to sort of express a gameplay idea and wrap that up in an aesthetic that delivers maximum emotional weight. One of the best ways of doing that is to try and keep things quite simple. With Frozen Cortex, the project got quite big and there was a lot happening in different areas, and it was really difficult to tie it all together. I think we did a good job, and the team certainly did a heroic job, particularly Richard Whitelock, our lead artist, and Martin Binfield, our animator on that game. Just fantastic amounts of hard work were done to put it all together. Of course, Ian Hardingham, who is the designer and coder, was the linchpin, and as usual, he is someone who's very good at finishing. Having someone on your team who has the skill of finishing a project, pushing everyone into that kind of narrow window of release and cutting off all the sort of vagueness, you need someone who has that skill, and Ian has that skill in spades, so that's how we were able to finish the game at all. We still have bugs and so on to take care of, and we're working on that as we speak, but getting the game into a shippable condition was kind of tremendously hard on this project, and that's something to watch out for as well. So that's a few sort of general things about what it's like to launch a game. Now, one specific thing that I think developers could take note of, and also maybe fans aren't that aware of, is that getting your game reviewed is quite difficult now, mostly because of the schedules that a lot of sites have. So with Frozen Synapse, we were able to put out review code kind of actually just a few days before launch, and we got reviews coming through at launch. There was a lot of buzz around that game as well. With this game, we sent out review code a week and a half in advance, and we just didn't even hear back from some places, and we still are waiting for quite a few major sites to put their reviews out, just mostly because of scheduling, and also because even since 2011 a lot of the people we knew at different sites have gone, so getting that direct contact is very hard. We tried to establish more of that with trailers and so on leading up to launch, some of the sillier press things that we did, But even that wasn't enough to kind of get traction, and the reason for that now is this environment. So many cool things came out. I mean, Darkest Dungeon, Hands of Fate, Sunless Sea was out, Medieval Engineers kind of came out around our launch window, so that's like 4 or 5 games that are kind of really big and interesting and people want to do a lot of coverage of. This is only going to get worse. One of the reasons I'm talking to you now is that I think discussing the process is one of the only ways to kind of keep people interested now. Because everyone's developing games, I think hearing about the actual process, the ins and outs of it, is going to have a more interesting, wider audience. Look at what Tom Francis is doing with his kind of series on how to make a game. He's using his expertise to kind of get out to a wider audience and kind of contribute more. So hopefully my Waffling will do something along those lines as well. That's kind of enough about launching and about Frozen Cortex in particular. I want to talk about the games industry in general now. As I said, I think the term industry is a bit silly now. What's really happening is that anyone can make a game right through from basic twine games all the way up to very sophisticated stuff that looks like AAA coming from sometimes ex-AAA people. I mean, look at stuff like Grey Goo. I mean, that is a really good example of a game which is inherently indie but has these kind of old school AAA production values behind it. So there's this vast range now, and something that really annoys me is people being reactionary about that on any side of that debate. So you have these big kind of movie-like AAA franchises, which is okay to kind of hate on, you know, if you're an indie, you don't like that kind of thing. I don't like a lot of those games. But saying that they're invalid or that they're inherently wrong or something is kind of ludicrous, because that is a massive audience. Similarly, free-to-play games. A lot of people love free-to-play games, and they play them because they like them. And so just kind of dismissing all of that, although it's cool to bash them, and I've bashed them in the past, and I hate a lot of them myself, I think saying they're invalid is also wrong. Similarly, you know, Gone Home is now like the poster child of the non-game, whereas I think that's one of the most fantastic games ever made. And it has a lot of qualities to it which are extremely game-like, and it comments on games, and it's a very sophisticated piece of work. So saying that something is invalid, what you're basically doing there is just demonstrating that games are a mature medium now. If you look at the history of theatre, the history of literature, every time there was a big, this isn't a proper play, proper novel, proper poem, whatever, it was just a sort of weird artifact of the fact that the medium was changing and developing and becoming more interesting. So all you're doing when you're saying that stuff is just contributing to this general idiocy. Similarly, I think there are quite a lot of people saying very asinine things about games. It's all very well to say, you know, oh, follow your dreams and make what you want and so on. Your dreams may not align with anything that anyone else is interested in. So what you have to really think about is how you can get people to access what you think is cool about the idea. Having been through a big struggle on that recently, I think that might actually be one of the key skills of a game designer or of a game development team, is to translate your initial feeling of, hey, wouldn't it be cool if, into an actual reality. There are still people who will send me ridiculous game ideas or will talk about their game ideas sort of as if the idea was the reality. I think that's dying out a lot now because people are really getting the skills. But like I say, the most important skill I think is that translation of idea to something that someone else can relate to in a practical context. What I really want to see in the games industry is the ability to focus more on the creative work that people are doing, the critical work that people are doing as work. I think the cult of personality might be a problem. We are seeing some kind of more tabloidy elements kind of come through, and I would really like to just say, focus back on the work and focus back on the really, really interesting things people are doing. Let's not have any boundaries to anyone, no matter what their demographic, being able to make games and do interesting things without anything related to that. I think as games mature as a medium, what we can do is really focus on the output. I think a problem that we have in the games industry at the moment is that we lack a vocabulary for discussing games properly. We don't really have a good way of talking about the interrelation of mechanics and aesthetic. So what we're doing is kind of coming up with these very vague, blurry descriptions of games, or on the other hand, sort of waving them around as a stick to beat something with. Gone Home, I think, is something that has been used as a stick to beat something with. It's been pilloried by people who don't really have a very good understanding of what anything is, frankly. The problem that I have is that people aren't looking at these things as games. They are just looking at them as ideas. Similarly, I think games criticism lacks the sophistication in general when it's dealing with what someone is trying to accomplish as a whole. That's a poor generalisation, I think, to some extent. But I also think that we're kind of, the vocabulary that we're discussing things with is very limited. And that's why we've had big outpourings of anger and big kind of confusion, is that we're not really applying ourselves to looking at this huge rich variety of new games and sort of figuring out what they mean and what's interesting about them. Games can range from pure empty entertainment, which is great and everyone wants that, through to extremely profound artistic experiences that have a lot of different nuance and that take a long time to unpick and that need to be discussed at great length. And all of that continuum is totally valid and cohabits the same area. So if you're not able to cope with that as an idea, I don't think raging about it is going to accomplish anything. If there is something that you disagree with about a particular game or a style of game, do something considered to react against it. If you hate those games that are boring and have no content, make a game that you find exciting. Write an essay about why you think that's not a valid creative direction that is considered. Make a video about it. Show all these different types of games. Show what you think games should be. Basically, what I'm saying is try and find a way to be intelligent and constructive about it. We don't all have to hold hands and agree with each other, as some people would suggest in a kind of asinine way. We can have a combative environment where there's heated discussion and arguments and so on, but frame your arguments in a way that is interesting and adds content into the discussion, as opposed to merely detracting from all of the stuff that everyone else is making around you. I would really like to see that happen, and I think games growing might provide the space for voices to come in. Maybe developers have to do this themselves. Maybe developers who actually make games, who understand games, should talk about other people's games more, because we're lacking the right way of discussing stuff and the right way of portraying this fascinating material so that other people can relate to it. There are journalists who are doing fantastic work, and long may they continue to do that. But isn't it time that we, as a medium, as an industry, started looking forwards and actually looking for a way to express to everyone why what we're doing matters in some way?